Hello and welcome to Compounding Curiosity. I'm your host Kalani Scarrett, and this podcast is all about compounding your curiosity alongside my own through thoughtful interviews with interesting guests. For transcripts and detailed show notes, check out the links in the description. Hopefully you're as keen as me to learn something new, so let's get stuck in. So another deep dive today, this time on Grab. So my guest today who will be chatting about Grab is Pratyush Rastogi. Pratyush is the CEO and founder of Farah Wealth Advisors and was previously head of sales at Grab for Business, as well as having prior experience in private equity. Today's conversation obviously is all about Grab, so we go deep on their business model, Grab's history, how regulation and management affect them, and what the future may hold. So just for reference, this episode was recorded on the 29th of December 2021, but either way, I hope you enjoy my conversation and deep dive on Grab with Pratyush Rastogi. Pratyush, thank you so much for being on today, but I think a probably natural or logical place to start would be with Grab and your history with them. So what got you interested with them, or what's your background and relationship there?
Thanks, Kalani. It's a pleasure to be back, and looking forward to speaking to you about Grab. Just as a disclaimer, I don't own any shares in Grab, and this is just a discussion for hypothetical purposes. But to answer your question, my history with Grab, I actually started working with Grab in 2016. So I was coming back from the US. I came back to Singapore, and I just finished business school. And in business school, I had taken a break from the investing world and got into entrepreneurship and sales. So when I came back to Singapore, I wanted to continue that. And Grab was doing really well in the region. For one, I was really impressed that it was a homegrown startup that was doing. I think at that time in 2016, they had just raised about 800 million, a round that was about a big round that was about 800 million. Obviously, they raised much more money since then. And they were not only a homegrown startup, but they were actually doing really well against a very formidable global competitor, which was Uber. And that was quite impressive, right? Because typically what would happen in most of the world is, you'd have a business model that worked in the US, and that US company would expand and typically become the business, the dominant business in that part of the world. But that wasn't the case, and Grab was doing really well. So for those two reasons, I was quite interested in Grab. And plus they had, business development roles, which was right up my alley on sales. And so, interviewed with them, joined them in 2016, and I worked for them for about 18 months. And my job was I ran what's now called Grab for Business in Singapore. So Grab for Business is the B2B segment of Grab. And our goal was to convince companies to ask their employees to take Grab for their corporate transport. So whether they're going for meetings or whether they're going to the airport, anything related to their work, their first thought in their mind is, I need to get somewhere, I'm going to call Grab. And we provide them with a tool that made the back-end process of claims and reimbursements very, very simple. So that was really our goal. And while my official title was head of sales, I was also in charge of operations. I was involved in building the product. And so it was really just a catch-all role for that part of the business in Singapore. And since Grab, obviously, I left Grab to start the foundations of what is now Farah Wealth. But I'm still very much in touch with my ex-colleagues. Every now and then I'll meet with some people who still work there who are my friends. So I've kept up with the company throughout the years.
Yeah, and that's perfect for today's episode, which is all about Grab. So this might be a tall ask for a business like Grab, but could you maybe just describe how you think about them as a steady state today? So what are the major aspects of them, and where does all the revenue come from, and how has maybe that evolved over time?
Yeah, sure. So Grab is branded as a super app, and most of your listeners will be familiar with what a super app is. And essentially, typically a super app will start with one core business, whether it's in payments, whether it's in transport, whether it's in food, whether it's in e-commerce, right? As you know, the super app concept really came from China, where you had the likes of Alibaba and Tencent. And for Grab is no different. They had a core business to start with, and that was mobility and specifically ride hailing, right? So very much using your phone to call a cab or a private hire vehicle to get you from point A to point B. And that was essentially how the company started, right? And I'm sure we'll get into the more history, and there's a lot of details there, but their core business has fundamentally been mobility. Now, Grab right now has about a 70% market share in Southeast Asia for mobility. It has competitors. Its main competitors are, there's Gojek in Indonesia, which is now now merged with Tokopedia to form Go2. There's local taxi companies that have really upped their game. So those are the kind of the key competitors in that space. So, but they're really the dominant name in transport in this region, and as I said, 70% market share. Now, obviously, that was the starting point. So they have now built up other services on their app. The key second service is deliveries, and that is food delivery. It is something that really ramped up once they acquired Uber in this part of the world, and that battle between Uber and Grabs is a really important part of their history, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And so now they probably have about a 50% share in food delivery in the region. And then lastly, the third key component is financial services. And this is where, they're offering loans both to consumers and merchants. They're offering insurance products. Obviously, they don't originate, but they're brokering that insurance. And then the last part is payments, which is driven by the Grab Pay wallet, right? Which is basically allows you to both pay for Grab services on app as well as services off app, like at restaurants or anything like that. In terms of, and just, to encompass all this, this is a very Southeast Asia story. Grab is very focused on Southeast Asia. It is in every country Southeast Asia except for Laos, Brunei, and East Timor. And that has been their story. And their goal is to, what they say, drive Southeast Asia forward. And they've actually been very successful at that. And the regard is, one is the consumer experience has been much better. If you think about what life was like pre these kinds of services, trying to hail a cab in the middle of the rain and things like that, or trying to get food delivery done, or even trying to pay for anything. And so they've done that. Plus, they've also created a lot of jobs. I think on last count, some publicly information that I saw online was, I think, they had 2.8 million drivers, which is millions of jobs created across the region. So they have been quite successful in improving the overall consumer experience as well as just welfare for Southeast Asia. Now, in terms of revenue, so obviously all the revenue is driven by most of the is driven by users transacting on their apps. So they have about 24.8 million monthly users as per the last quarterly release. They do about 16 to 20 billion in GMV a year, and I'm giving you a range because COVID has really caused some parts of business, especially mobility, to be reduced in the temporary range. But if you kind of annualize the GMV from Q3, you get to 16 billion. But I think if you kind of ramp up mobility and assume that COVID didn't exist, then it would probably be somewhere in between 16 to 20. So as I said, deliveries probably does about 10 billion of that. Mobility does about that 6 billion, but again, that's a skewed number. And and the take rates there are anywhere between 18 to 20% depending on the service. And those take rates have been improving. And that's where they make most of their money. Now, as I mentioned, they have businesses in financial services, but there the revenues are still really quite small. And they also have a small segment called enterprise, which somewhat involves what I used to be working on, but is predominantly now driven by advertising. So advertising on vehicles, for allowing companies to advertise on vehicles and on the app, on different kind of inventory spaces that the company might own. And that's actually quite a profitable business, but again, quite small at this point.
So now you mentioned a little bit about Grab's history, and a key part of that is their battle with Uber. So could you just describe maybe what that was like and maybe highlight some of Grab's history that we haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah, so Grab was started by Anthony Tan and Huiling Tan. They're not related. They have the same surname, but not related. And as a business school case study project when they were in Harvard. And if anybody's ever been to business school, there's a lot of these pitch competitions when it comes to startups. You create a startup with your colleagues and you pitch it, and you're supposed to actively run it while you're in these competitions. So they have this idea to post Grab, and the history comes from the founders are from Malaysia, and at times in this part of the world, taking a taxi cannot be safe. There's two reasons for that. There's the actual personal safety issue, but there's also an honesty issue, right? Sometimes the meter is not very fair, or drivers will take the wrong route, and it's not a very pleasant experience. And so, for example, the story we were told when we joined Grab is that Huiling Tan used to actually, she'd come home late from work at night, and she'd be worried in the cab, so she'd be on a cell phone with her mom the whole time just to kind of talk to somebody, because she was worried about the safety issue. And so really it started, related to the safety and integrity issue, when a problem that people had with the experience when they took cabs. So it initially started in Malaysia as MyTaxi. That was the original name of the company, and it was just a booking app for actual taxis. And we'll talk about how they kind of built the fleet, but the initial story was quite a boots on the ground story, right? They basically, Anthony Tan and his team had to go. Basically, they would wait in lines at the airport to try to talk to taxi drivers to get them to try to use their app. And almost all of them said no. And then finally, they convinced the smallest fleet in Malaysia to kind of take their to use their app, and that's how they started. And it was a very kind of transactional model, right? You would basically just make, I think, maybe a few cents for a booking fee to basically allow that transaction to happen. So it wasn't the same model that you saw now, but that's where they started. But obviously they started to do very well, right? And once they saw that Uber model kind of pick up in the US, two things. One, it was just a good model, right? We can increase the fleet beyond just what are legacy taxis. But secondly, it's also money to make a way to make more money, right? Here, you were maybe getting 20 cents per booking just for taxis, but then now with the private car model, you could actually get 20% off the entire fare, right? So it was a very much more lucrative model as well. So as they started to go into that, that's when growth really started happening. I think the first couple of years were quite sleepy. And then it's really around 2014, 2015, especially when they got the big funding from Vertex Ventures, which is the VC arm of Temasek, which is the big sovereign wealth fund in Singapore. They really started to expand, and they moved the headquarters from Malaysia to Singapore. And that's when they really started that trajectory that has continued till this day. And there was a number of competitors at the time. There was Gojek, as I said. There were local companies, but the big bad competitor was Uber, which was everywhere in Southeast Asia. How did that work? So now to answer your question about why how they did against Uber. So now Uber was a very tough competitor, and when I was working there, they had very good tech, right? They had the smartest talent in California working on their technology. It was a very smooth interface, right? They had a lot of money. It was very easy for them to come in, and not easy, but it was very feasible for them to come in and go to all these markets very quickly, right? And they had branding, right? People had heard of Uber. People had heard, I traveled to America, or I traveled to Europe, and I saw, people using this company. It's a great experience. So it was it made them a very formidable competitor, right? But Grab did three things really well, right? For one is they pioneered fixed pricing. So if you remember back in 2014, 15, if you took an Uber, it would give you a range of what the cost could be, but you only found out the final range at the end, right? Now Grab started with fixed pricing. Now, the funny story was, I don't know if they actually, saw this beforehand, and I think a lot of the fixed pricing was the fact is they were still trying to get the dynamic pricing going, but they needed to get the app out, and so they kind of just launched fixed pricing just as a stopgap. But they stumbled upon a very unique customer insight that I thought was really powerful, right? If you think about anything you consume, it's very rare to know the price at the end of the consumption, right? If you take a flight, you paid for the ticket, you know how much it's going to cost you, right? If you buy a meal, you see the menu prices, right? You know exactly how much it's going to cost you by the end, right? But taxis are weird, right? Like, it's the only thing that you know the final price after you're done consuming it. So it's an odd consumer experience. So, and all of a sudden, you know beforehand exactly how much something's going to cost, right? It makes that, oh, okay, well, I know it's going to cost me $10 to go from point A to point B, right? So then you can weigh that cost benefit against taking public transport, against walking, against doing whatever. So that was a really unique thing that they did, and that really allowed them to gain a lot of business very quickly. The second thing was Grab was a local player, right? Uber was not, right? Uber operated very much that how America works, that's how the world works. They were not very good at localization. But Grab knew that Southeast Asia is very underbanked. Most people don't have credit cards. Most people don't have debit cards. And again, they're based in Singapore. Singapore is a bit of a different story. But if you travel around Southeast Asia, there are parts of Southeast Asia that are still, quite poor and still, are very underbanked. So they allowed for cash to transact on their app, and there's a lot of interesting details of how they made that work. But essentially, cash was easy. So drivers would carry some change, but they also used nice round numbers for their taxi fares. So it was very easy to make chains and things like that. So that also really benefited. And if you think about it, it also reduced any friction for you as a consumer to download the app and start. All you had to do was feed in your mobile number and you could book. You didn't have to feed in your credit card. You didn't have to do any of that. You could just select cash and you're off and running, right? So that allowed adoption to happen. And then, they started to do a lot of things that were very localized. And one of the, and this was later on, but for example, they realized that, we need to make it easy for people a traveler in Singapore to be able to go to Malaysia and use Grab, or go to Indonesia, or go to the Philippines, right? And where that language barrier exists, they allowed for auto translation through their app, right? So you could communicate with the driver in your language, whereas it's translating into the driver's language. So it allowed a traveler from Singapore to now, because you've acquired this customer in Singapore, but they are now a customer for you around the region, right? Rather than just in your country. So that was a really powerful scaling model as well. So they were very good at the hyperlocalization. And the last thing was, they also managed to raise a lot of money, right? Anthony Tan, one of the things I've always said about him, he's amazing at being able to raise money. They raised a lot of money from SoftBank. I think total they raised about $10 billion right before this combination with Altimeter. And they were very successful in deploying that to kind of win that battle. And it did help to a certain extent that Uber was also quite distracted during this period of time. If you remember, this was when Travis Kalanick was getting fired. This was when they were having a lot of issues with their culture in their company. They were having a lot of political battles. So these kind of issues caused them to kind of lose track, and they just lost a big battle in China, for example, right? So Didi and companies like that had kind of pushed them out of China. So they were also licking their wounds, and Grab was putting up this really strong battle, and it managed to kind of in 2018 cause the two companies to combine essentially.
Yeah, no, that's some awesome insight, and it's common to talk about the demand for the business, but an interesting aspect of Grab is that key part of their business model relies on the supply of drivers. And you mentioned Anthony Tan at the airport. So what's the history of getting drivers at Grab? Have they acquired drivers in the past, and today, how have they done it? And what are the things that matter on the supply side?
Yeah, I mean, so there's two parts of it, right? There's always the private hire fleet, and then there's the taxi fleet. The taxi fleet, it is element of gamesmanship and deal making, right? You have to convince taxis who come on your platform that you're not there to take their business, but you're there to enhance their business, right? And for and again, I don't know what the unit economics are now, but for a long time it was just all Grab really made was just a small booking fee. And what it allowed, and it was a very smart move, right, is because it allowed them to increase their fleet very quickly by getting these taxi companies on board, at least the ones that agreed to partner with them. Because they're like, look, we have the distribution for you. We'll charge you very minimal amounts, right? And your drivers, who now have to circle around in the rain trying to find passengers won't have to do that, right? And this is before most of these taxi companies had apps. Now they do, but a couple years ago they didn't. So it was a very smart proposition from Grab's perspective. It's very smart to get all these people on board, because one of the frustrations you have as a consumer is it's a very emotional thing. If you need to get somewhere, you need to get somewhere quickly, and you don't want to be waiting a long time. So the bigger the fleet, even if you're not making a lot of money off it, right, the smarter it is in the consumer perspective, because the consumer is like, oh, it doesn't really matter to me if I'm getting a taxi or am I getting a private vehicle, as long as I get from point A to point B. So for those reasons, it was a very smart proposition, and Grab kind of launched this hybrid thing, called for a while called Just Grab, which was a mix of both taxis and private hire vehicles, because that really just expanded the supply for the consumer, which was, I thought, a very smart move. Now, so on the taxi side, you have to maintain relationships with the leaders, the owners of those taxi companies, those taxi fleets. Yeah, you have to have kind of good relations with them, and at times it was contentious. At times it was a very good partnership. So that was just about navigating. On the private hire side, it's really just about you have to build not only trust with the drivers, but you have to give them an ability to become drivers, right? So, for example, what happens if they don't own a car? Are you going to limit yourself to only people who own a car? What happens if they own a car that's not very, was quite old or not very, up to speed in terms of, what you want to present to your customer, right? So they had to create a kind of a rentals a platform where drivers could go rent cars, right? So that was a really key part of it. And Grab Rentals was a big part of that story, where they essentially created drivers. It wasn't just that they were asking drivers to join, they actually created a whole kind of history of drivers. Secondly, they also had to convince people that this was a viable financial option for them, right? And that came through incentives, and that was obviously expensive, but incentives to drivers that basically like, look, if you drive for us, if you drive 8-10 hours a day, you will make a good wage. So that was also really key. And then the last thing is that it has to be built from a lot of tender love and care, right? It's you're dealing with people who are kind of the backbone of most economies, right? These are working class people, and they deserve respect, and they need to be treated with respect. And so Grab was very good because they had a lot of local leaders. They were good at building relationships with drivers. And, they had, I worked in Singapore, we worked at the headquarters, which used to be at Sin Ming Lane. Now, let's say they have this very nice building that they built themselves. But, back then we had an entire driver center there where drivers could come in and talk to people and, get all their questions answered, get trained, get everything they needed. And it was a really powerful way to show that, look, you're not just a random, supplier to us. You are a partner in our program. So they had to do that well. Now, obviously that never stopped bad media reports that said, Grab's taking advantage of drivers, or Grab's doing this, or Grab's doing that. Personally, and we'll talk about this a little bit about the culture, I always found that really far from the truth. I really don't think the company ever did anything like that. Obviously, there's still a business that's trying to make money. So yes, there is some conflict there, but I always found the media reports to be really, really kind of unfair. But it is a very on the ground effort, and it requires a lot of thought to build a fleet like that, and it's very hard to replicate. And I talked about this in my blog, which I released a couple of weeks. I don't see anybody being able to wrestle that position, that fleet away from them.
Yeah. And you mentioned Grab the Super app a little bit. Could you maybe explain and talk about what happens as a result of going into all those different verticals compared to if they had just stayed in ride sharing? So what do they gain from going into those different verticals that enhances all the other ones?
Well, it's a story of customer acquisition costs, and it's a story of TAM, total addressable market. So customer acquisition costs, see, look, you've already spent all this customer acquisition costs getting this customer to become a ride-hailing customer of yours. You would be foolish to not then want to on-sell them to something else, because they are now using your app. So if you present something to them and they use it, it's almost done at zero customer acquisition cost. And then certain products not only are zero customer acquisition cost, but also increases the lifetime value of the customer. So for example, if you go from a transacting customer where each time you're paying in cash, to a transacting customer who has a credit card on file, to a transacting customer who has not only the credit card on file, but also has credit in the terms of their Grab wallet on the app, the lifetime value, that stickiness of that customer increases significantly than if you only had ride hailing on the platform. So it's a really important story that it's not just, it's a customer acquisition cost and higher LTV story, right? The other thing of it is the TAM for ride hailing. And again, and my memory's a bit hazy here, but so people can fact check this. But back in when we were talking about it internally, it was about a $50 billion market, whereas payments was at least a $500 billion to $1 trillion market. Right? So it was a significant scale of difference, a significant scale of opportunity difference, right? And if you only stick to ride hailing, which you've seen the likes of Lyft do, you are to a certain, and if you're not going to expand, right, and it grabs in Southeast Asia, but then your valuation the values of the company will always kind of be a bit stagnant. So because as they get into new products, your TAM increases. And lastly, it's just it's a better customer experience, right? If I can go to one place to get a lot of these different options, right? So for example, I'm a regular Grab user still, right? I will use it regularly for transport, for delivery, and on occasion I will use it to pay for things. Immediately for me, I have three kind of needs taken care of through one app. So that's where that benefit comes in.
Yeah, great. And I'd love to understand your view just on Grab's scale and capital. So you've already mentioned about the 10 billion total they've raised, which is a decent chunk of their current market cap, but they've spent a fair portion of that cash just to get this level of scale. So is that a yesterday story? Is it still current? And do you think maybe that need for capital continues into the future, and does it concern you?
So the answer is yes. It is a factor to very much pay attention to, and it certainly could be a concern. So let me kind of put this in perspective. If I look at the Q3 filings, right, that they just released, deliveries did $422 million of gross billing. Gross billing being just the total money Grab gets from not GMV, but the actual revenue that Grab gets, right? And I'm being a bit loose with the word revenue because Grab defines revenue different ways, and ride-hailing and delivery companies actually are across the world define revenue in very various ways, right? But if you just look at the revenue they bring is $422 million. Of that $422 million, they paid out $374 million in incentives, right? So you're only looking at a kind of an 11% gross margin, right? If you kind of look at it in that perspective. So it's a very tough battle because you have a number of delivery companies that are in Southeast Asia competing against them. You have Deliveroo, you have Food Panda, you have Gojek's delivery services. Every country I think they compete in, they have at least two pretty strong competitors. And these are not Uber type competitors. These are local competitors. They're not going anywhere. So they're going to fight for that share of the pie continually. And it's quite, and there's a lot of connotation to this. And to a while we thought, deliveries is going to do super well in the US, the likes of Instacart and things are doing really well in the US. But now you have a whole bunch of new delivery companies that raise tons of money, right? That are essentially, focused on really, really quick delivery, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 15 minutes. And, there's the like of Gorilla and Buick in the US that are doing really well. and have raised a lot of money. So that deliveries battle is never. It doesn't seem to be finished in the U.S., and I really don't think it's finished in Southeast Asia. And it is, as I said, in my blog post, it's a knife fight. And now you have, a new player, which is C, and I know you just did a deep dive in C with our friend Punchcard Investor. They are getting into deliveries through Shopee Food, and they have a lot of money to spend. To put it in perspective, Grab has probably on their balance sheet about $9 billion in gross cash after this combination. C has $11.8 billion, but if you think about it, Grab, while it does a very good job in drawing margin out of its mobility business, right? They'll probably max. I think with the next year maybe do 500 million in EBITDA through that business, whereas Shopee funds its business through Garena, and they'll probably do about 2.5 to 3 billion, right? So there's a scaling difference here that Grab's going to have to reckon with. And they're going to be in this fight, I think, for a while when it comes to deliveries. And to your point, they've raised all this money because they know this fight is coming, right? And they know, it's already there. And they're going to have to be prepared. So while I think they've done a good job of locking up transport, although that being, as I wrote, that turns out C has actually partnered with Bluebird, which is the largest taxi fleet in Indonesia, to offer transport services. But I actually think that's more Bluebird flexing its muscles rather than and C just kind of seeing an opportunistic element there. But as much as but that being said, I still think Grab will do just fine on the mobility side. I think the delivery side is a very difficult battle, and it is still to be seen who in the end will really come out victorious or who will win without too much damage to their balance sheet.
And you touched on culture a lot earlier. From your time having worked at Grab, what do you think are some of the unappreciated aspects of Grab and their business and culture?
So I'll talk about what I think are the good elements, and I'll talk about where I think there could be some potential issues. As a culture, I think Grab was very much, as I said, there was at times there was these negative articles in the press. I always thought they were unfair. Grab was very much a culture of do right by the drivers, do right by the consumers. But try to stay in business, right? So you couldn't give away everything, but you did what you could to do the best job possible for the drivers. And sometimes you fell short, right? In the end, the company's made up of humans, and humans err, and they fall short, and sometimes that happened. But there was never this this notion that we're going to try to get our pound of flesh off the driver or the consumer. Nothing like that. It was just trying to build the best product possible. And I think that was kind of misrepresented, I think. The other thing that people maybe don't quite understand is, and Dennis Hong from Shawspring Partners has coined this term as cognitive reference, right? Where essentially grab is now a verb, right? You don't think about, you don't say call a taxi, you'll say, let me call a Grab, right? Or if you want delivery, you'll be like, we'll just order from Grab, right? So it is becoming, it's kind of like that Airbnb type situation that Uber in the US or Xerox for, I don't know if there are any Indian listeners on this, but we never said photocopy, we'd always say Xerox, right? So these are the things that really implant themselves in the mind, and Grab is quite ubiquitous across Southeast Asia, and it's quite a feat considering Southeast Asia is not a monolith, right? Every country is different. Every country is a different language, culture, religion, and it is not this one blank space like one similar space like the U.S. or China is. It is quite similar. So, but beyond they're quite ubiquitous across these markets. So I think those are really impressive parts of Grab's culture that I think will help them sustain no matter what happens with these businesses. So those are really powerful parts of Grab's arsenal, I would say.
So you touched on it very briefly there, but is there anything that people fundamentally misunderstand about Grab, in your opinion?
I don't know if there's a misunderstanding per se. I think there's just a couple of things that I think I've heard investors talk about that I would say are I think not as straightforward as they want to present. As I said, Southeast Asia is not ubiquitous, right? It is not a homogenous market. Each country is different, each fight is different, and you can't simply say, success in A will lead to success in B or C. Right. Now, Grab has done a very good job of that, but that is no means granted or guaranteed. The key part of I found that in terms of where people don't quite understand is their mobility business is actually really quite profitable. And people, have long say, Grab has no way of making money. And that's not really true. If you think about what they make in terms of EBITDA to GMV, they make about 12 to 15%. Again, COVID kind of skews that number, but 12 to 15%. Uber makes 5.5%, Didi makes zero. Right. So it is they've done a very good job of making that business profitable. And there's a lot of, commentators who say, oh, there isn't a single ride hailing business in the world, that's made money. That's not true. Right. Grab is making money. Now you can argue that after overhead costs and so on and so forth, how much money are they making? And again, that remains to be seen, but they are at least on the EBITDA level making money on that part of transport. So I think that is kind of misunderstood by a lot of the market.
So to talk about Grab's leadership, how critical do you think Anthony Tan and Huiling Tan do you think are critical in Grab's future?
Anthony Tan is very critical. I was very impressed by his two things, right? As I said previously, he's very good at raising large sums of money. But, I would sit into meetings with him or we'd have leadership meetings, and a lot of times pre-meeting we would be talking about something and be like, oh, we don't know if we can do this, or this looks hard. And he would walk into the meeting and people would tell him about it, and then he has this way to really convince people to try these things that seem really impossible. And that was really important, right? Because he's really that kind of like that person pushing people forward, and it's really important when you're up against difficult competitors, difficult conditions, very competitive environments. So he was very good at that, and I think a lot of the vision and that host of Driving Southeast Asia Forward, it really comes from him. Let me say this: I think it would be a very bearish thing if he were to ever leave the company. In my personal opinion. Now, that being said, in terms of leadership, and this is one of the things I touched on in my blog, and this is sometimes where and this is not just a Grab problem. I do worry about this by a lot of companies that have had a number of success and the type of leadership that they put into place, right? It is sometimes when they get big, and Grab is no longer a startup, right? It's now a listed entity. It's worth, depending on the day, anywhere between $25 to $30 billion. But sometimes what happens is that you tend to then hire people from organizations who are used to a steady state, right? And Ben Horowitz actually talks about this in his book, The Hard Things About Hard Things, right? And a lot of times with startups, the mistake they'll make is they'll hire these guys from Cisco or from IBM, these companies that have had very low growth but very stable growth for long periods of time, and they put them into this chaotic environment, and it just doesn't gel. And if you don't mind, I'll bring up a story from history that I think is really relevant here. So, in World War I, France was actually known to be quite a fighting force, right? They had a very developed army. They had been in a number of conflicts across history. And in Europe, they were actually known to have a very strong military. So in World War I, when the Germans attacked, people expected that the French to be able to repel them off the German Western Front. Actually, what happened is the Germans smashed the French military on the Western Front. And the commander of the time of the French army was this guy named Joseph Joffre. And he was like, what just happened, right? We are a formidable fighting force. And he found out that a lot of the generals who had gone to the front were generals who were very experienced, but they had experienced peacetime for many years. And they were actually teaching at the universities, they were teaching the military academy, and forgot what it was like to fight. And what he did was that he then replaced all of them with people who had far more recent military fighting experience, right? And that helped change the tide significantly, right? And so you want generals in the field who are battle hardened. And bringing that story back, I hope Grab remembers that it's still in this kind of fight, right? Especially on delivery and in financial service. And you want your battle hardened generals going there. And C has just done this, right? C, for example, has just elevated Chris Fang, right, who was head of Shopee and a very aggressive battle hardened general to basically a much more senior role where he's going to oversee even more things, right? And what they've done is, they have this global expansion where they're going to South America, they're going to Europe to launch e-commerce business there. They've sent all their successful kind of lieutenants and generals from those parts of from this part of the world there to win those battles. And the reason I bring this up, and again, I feel like I might be kind of unfairly dumping this guy, but they just hired a CEO, right, from Sats, which is a very stable company. And it grows 4 to 5%. It's a very protective space. They basically do in-flight catering from Changi Airport in Singapore. And as CEO, and he's going to oversee very, very important parts of the business that are in the fight. So, this is where I see a potential risk in leadership, and I hope I'm wrong. But certainly a risk that I've noticed that happens at Grab, but happens at a lot of companies, that after they've achieved a certain level of success, that complacency kind of kicks in, and I hope that's not the case.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer and story. Does it worry you at all, Anthony Tan's 2.2% stake in Grab? Like, how do you think about that? How do you view that?
So it's no secret Anthony is from a very rich family in Malaysia. His family runs Tanjong Motors. If you look at any kind of rich list in Malaysia, usually the family's mentioned. It's not unusual, So I don't think that he's in this for the money. I think he was wealthy before this, and I think he will be wealthy. Even if all goes ahead, all goes wrong, he will still be wealthy. I really don't think he's in it for the money. So I don't think that's an issue. But that being said, he still owns most of the voting rights. So he's still very much in control of the company, and I think that's important because I think he is still trying to build out this vision for what he wants, what Southeast Asia could be, and when I did have my one-on-one with him, he was very much about this, right? He was very much about, I want to do these things. I want to help that farmer in Indonesia. I want to do these things. So that story is far from finished, and as long as he has control of the company, I think that's far more incentive than the money. Would be my personal opinion about the issue.
Yeah, fair enough. And in terms of regulation, what can we learn from Grab's story dealing with regulators and that aspect of the business? So you wrote how Grab has an ability of working with governments where Uber has a tendency to maybe antagonise them. How did Grab achieve that?
Well, it's a little bit like, again, Uber had this culture of this Silicon Valley of move fast and break things, right? And that works to a certain extent. You're seeing governments push back all across the world, whether it's Facebook and its privacy issues, whether it's with Uber and what's happening in the UK, it's with or big tech in general, right? And I think Grab saw, look, we are a Southeast Asian startup, right? Or when it was a startup. We want to work with governments. We want to be on their good side. And I think that was a very smart move, right? You don't necessarily want to antagonize governments here, which to a certain extent have a lot more ability to shut you down than say in the West, which would have to go through courts and so on and so forth. So that was done through relationships with the government built. They had dedicated teams working with the governments. They did a $2 billion deal via SoftBank. So SoftBank invested in Grab, and Grab committed to investing $2 billion in Indonesia, including in Link Aja, which is the local payment system. So that showed that we're here to build Southeast Asia. We're here for the long run, and we're here to work with you, not against you. And I think they played that part very well. And even in my role when I was head of Grab for Business for Singapore, we actually worked on business with the government to allow government employees to take transport. Right, so these kinds of things are done so that Grab has a multiple relationship touch points with governments, both as somebody as constituent, as a supplier, as tax paying entities, so on and so forth. And I think that is done quite well. And you're seeing Uber have a lot of these problems in Europe, and for a while they had privacy issues in the US. So I find in this part of the world it's much better to work with governments than against them.
Yeah, definitely agree. And you wrote that you think Southeast Asia is Grab's to lose. So in your opinion, if we envision a scenario, how do they lose? Is it mismanagement, competitors, hiring problems? What's the biggest risk to the business overall, do you reckon?
I think competition is the number one thing, and they are still going to have to spend a lot of money to maintain market share. Right? Now, the pie is growing. So there's a counter argument to be say, okay, they might lose market share, but the pie is so underpenetrated that even if they lose market share, they'll still grow their business, which very much could be the case. But when you are priced at growth valuations and you start to lose market share, the market doesn't really love that very much, right? They start to see that as a huge negative, even though you might be growing your top line. So competition is, I think, a significant part of it. I think certainly, success can breed complacency, and you have to remember that there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think they're realizing that. For example, and I gave this example about potential hiring. You want to hire battle hardened generals. They are now actually internally promoting people who have been with the company a long time and won these battles to more higher levels and responsible for more business lines and more important business lines. So, for example, They made Kel J Lim, who somebody I have a lot of respect for, who used to be the head of Singapore. He's head of Grab Financial Group in Singapore now, and that's a really big part of their story going forward. So having someone like him there, is actually very a strong indication that they haven't forgotten that they still have a long way to go, and they need their best people behind these projects. So yeah, I mean, sorry, to answer your question, I think the biggest risks are competition. The biggest risks are, complacency, and regulation's always going to be a risk, right? When you're dealing with, drivers and delivery people, that can always become political. Drivers are watching what's happening in some parts of the world where governments are saying, you know what, these are not contractors. They are actually your employees and need to treat them as such, right? And the funny part is, this doesn't necessarily have to be a government push thing. Competition could force them to change their business model, because, as I mentioned, in the delivery business in the US, for example, with Gorilla and these companies, they've actually hired all these delivery people as full-time employees, right? So all of a sudden, people will start looking at that model and being like, hey, why aren't we doing that? So that could also be a risk to their business model. So I think those are the three things that I would say. The other thing is, it'll be interesting to see how they retain talent now that they've listed and now that people have a chance to liquidate their holdings, right? Will people move on? Will they have to hire a whole bunch of people? Now, Grab has a history of not being able to, hold on to a CTO for a while. They've had multiple CTOs, and so these guys, if that churn increases, especially on the top level, that could cause some problems. So I think those are the potential risks behind the story.
Yeah. So maybe wrap up and close. Is there anything we haven't talked about Grab that's consequential for their future, in your opinion?
I think the only thing that perhaps we might not have touched on, or that's important to bear in mind, is that despite everything I've talked about, despite all the competition, despite all the potential issues and the money they're going to have to spend, Southeast Asia is still very underpenetrated. It's very underpenetrated in terms of transfer. I think if you compare the ratio of how much people spend on on ride hailing versus total personal consumption on transport, it's only about 5-10%. It's still very low. Right? Deliveries is still quite underpenetrated. Financial services is quite underpenetrated. So there is this tailwind that they have, that there's still a lot of room to grow in this part of the world. And I think that could be an interesting story that plays out over the next couple of years, and we see how big some of these businesses could potentially grow, especially financial services. And I say that because if you look at a company that's done really well with financial services, Mercado Libre in Latin America, and they, I think, they will start within the next couple of years earning 30% of their EBITDA through loans and through businesses that are actually very highly profitable. And while Grab does offer merchant loans and stuff, it's done at very low interest rates, and it's done, I think, very carefully. Whereas Mercado Libre has taken this thing where we're going to lend pretty heavily, but we're going to charge very high interest rates. So even though they have like a 30% default rate, they still make significant money off that business. So I think those are things I think that could really surprise the market from the upside if those elements of the business are done well, executed well, and can really lead to significant profitability, which I think the market is wanting to see more and more now, right, as interest rates rise. So I think that underpenetration and the fact is that they have a lot of interesting things they can do in financial services are large upsides potential for the company.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to wrap up. Pratyush, thank you so much for coming back on again. Final thoughts, anything you want to plug, anything else?
No, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. As usual, if people want to learn more about me, it's farrerwealth.com. That's FARRER. And that's usually the best place to find out information about us. And you can subscribe to our blog through that. And we have all our contact details there.
If you enjoyed this podcast episode, be sure to check out the website compoundingpodcast.com. On the website, you'll find every episode complete with transcripts, show notes, and other related resources. If you want an email notification every time an episode releases, plus my lessons and takeaways from each episode, be sure to sign up to the Substack. So that's compoundingcuriosity.substack.com. Either way, links to all content mentioned today will be in the description below, and you can also connect with me on Twitter @ScarrettKalani. But until next time, have a good one.